I haven't talked about it very much in a long time, but whenever you study scripture, one of the things that it's very important to do is to set it in its historical context. And where we are in the book of First Peter, chapter 2, this passage that I'm going to begin on this time requires a historical context, not necessarily for the deepest, strictest meanings, but it matters. So we're starting in verse 13. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. I used to be, when I was, in my late teens, I was kind of a political activist. I wanted to, of course, you got to remember this was in the 1970, and there was an interesting set of events happening in America from about 68 on. I thought we had to make the changes that needed to happen through politics and through people who were right-minded. And so, which I don't disagree with that even today. However, part of what I came to realize was politics didn't solve our problems. They rearranged the problems, and actually they even created some new problems, but they didn't solve our problems. So I then kind of became tried to be apolitical, meaning I just wouldn't have a political opinion. But I couldn't sustain that because I'm an opinionated person. I have very many and in some cases very strong opinions, especially about politics and values. So I couldn't sustain this apolitical view. Today, I am much more of a political pessimist. I think realistically, our government policies can make it worse or better for us as individual citizens, for our other institutions that are in the private sector. But I just don't think that any political party is going to be able to do the things that have to happen, in my opinion, to get us back onto a course that's not self-destructive. So I have this pessimism about how much any kind of political party or political activism can do to change things. Don't misunderstand me. I still think every citizen ought to vote their conscience, and that we still, with as many gaps and holes and broken pieces as are present in our current government and society here in America, folks, we still have the best situation on the globe. It's hard to bear that in mind when you watch the news and browse through Facebook and you see all the crud and all the difficulties and all of the brokenness front and center, where that's all you can see. Well, I didn't intend to start on a political or anti-political or even a politically pessimistic rant, but there you go, I sure did. Why it matters is because what Peter wrote to the original recipients of this letter was set in the historical context of his day and their day, in a situation that is way worse than any of us are living in today. bear in mind, we're in the 60s, not the 1960s. I mean the aught 60s. And during that period of time, the world was more or less owned by the Roman Empire. And there were wonderful good things about the Roman Empire. There are things that really kind of still catch my eye and make me wonder, how in the world did they figure that out in those ancient times without all of the aids of modern technology and all of the things that we have at our disposal? And they did some wonderful things and some awful things. 1/3 of the population of the Roman Empire were slaves. Some of them had been born into slavery. Some had sold themselves into slavery because of their debt. Others, and this was probably the larger number from the research I've done, were made slaves because of the conquest of the Roman Empire. They were taken from their own home, their homeland, and they were made slaves, then sold, and revenue, of course, went back into the empire. Was not a great time for anybody who wanted to have any kind of personal free speech. See, if you spoke out against the emperor, you stood the chance of getting shortened by a head. And you already know, I hope you already know, that many of the Roman emperors were decadent people. They had almost no moral underpinnings. They were until Constantine, they were all worshipers of the Roman pagan gods. And in fact, the emperor had made himself a god, and he was to be worshipped, not just honored, but worshipped by the citizens of Rome. Now put yourself in the sandals of a Christian in century 1 and bear in mind that the culture there, well, it was not very interested in what made you happy. Equal rights didn't exist. It was right. Might makes right. And that meant the biggest dog on the block was going to run the show. And so there are a lot of things about that would be very undesirable for us who've been raised in a democratic republic where we have the Constitution, we have our Bill of Rights, and the first of those amendments of the Bill of Rights gives us the freedom to say what we think. That was not a freedom in the first century, and Christians had been arrested, tortured, executed because of their belief, their faith in God. Set that in that context for these words. Submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human authority. Submit. It is not a very popular word. I recall when I first began doing premarital counseling, I was kind of making it up as I went along, and I knew that in Ephesians chapter 5, Paul gives probably the most salient explanation for the relationship between a husband and a wife and how they should relate. And so I would go there and we'd just do a Bible study to draw the truth out of that and then apply it into the couple's experience. And it begins with what back in the 80s and 90s was a very terse sounding statement. Wives, submit to your husbands as unto the Lord. That whole idea of submission had, for pretty good reason actually, become a very contentious issue. Unfortunately, the many Christian authors, preachers, teachers from Martin Luther on forward in the 1500s and earlier, relegated women to a position of subservience so that a woman had less status than a man. Of course, women were to submit to men. Men were to be their masters. Their husband was the master. And that's not really what that passage meant. And although I'd love to, I've already burned up 10 and a half minutes getting to what I wanted to talk about. So I'm not going to go deeply into that passage from Ephesians chapter 5, beginning in verse 21. But what I will say is the idea of submission it carries a lot of baggage for people in the 21st century. We don't like the idea of submission because what it means is you get your way and I don't get my way. That's not the complete meaning of that. You can be made to submit, but Peter here is talking about a voluntary submission. Now, the word that Peter used in Greek, which is the language in which he wrote, that word for submit in Greek means to align oneself beneath. It's a word that was used a lot in terms of military hierarchy, so that you have privates and corporals and sergeants and lieutenants and on up this hierarchical chart, so that a private would align themselves under the authority of the corporal and the corporal under the authority of the sergeant and so forth. This was because the structure of that military organization and operation obviously needed some kind of hierarchy in order for it to function well and achieve its purposes. What God says through Peter is that we are to submit ourselves for the Lord's sake. We are to submit ourselves rather than waiting for someone to make us submit. We are to do this of our own initiative, to align ourselves, to arrange ourselves under the authority of someone else. And why? For the Lord's sake. This is a little bit difficult for me to unpack, especially thinking about first century life and the very, I would consider, I think most of us today would consider, very bad political system. And yet Peter writes, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority. Submit yourself for the Lord's sake? What? I don't get it. Okay. That does not negate the fact that my first responsibility, my highest goal, my greatest objective is to submit myself, to align myself under the authority of God. That's a given. And now he says to submit ourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority. I wonder if what Peter was saying is when you submit yourself to and I'm going to frame it up very strictly, to the legal system under which you live, you choose to align yourself under the authority of these human authorities, you honor God. It is not just for the sake of peace, not just for the sake of being able to participate in the culture, not just for the sake of being able to buy and sell, which, by the way, those things could be taken from you by these authorities in Peter's day. For the Lord's sake. Maybe the way I would say it is because of how concerned I am that God's nature would be reflected in my behavior. For the Lord's sake. Not for my sake, but for the Lord's sake. And you have to be careful. I have to be careful with this, because what it's not saying is God needs me to defend his reputation. No, he doesn't. Not at all. He can defend himself. But I get this privilege of working within a culture, within a society, that in such a way that I could bring honor to God. Submit yourselves voluntarily, align yourself beneath the authority of another for the Lord's sake to all, every human authority. And we're going to unpack what specifically Peter talked about in terms of these human authorities. But boy, that's enough to kind of choke a horse right now. So I'm going to shut her down, and I look forward to when we can connect again like this next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.